In the high, thin air of 1889 Colorado, a lie could get you killed. But for Dr. Catherine Sullivan, a lie was the only thing keeping her alive. She stepped off the train in the dusty frontier town of Millbrook with a worn leather satchel in one hand and a carefully forged nursing certificate in the other. The paper was a masterpiece of deception, her ticket into a world that would never accept her for who she truly was. Because hidden beneath her modest gray dress wasn't the heart of a nurse. It was the mind of one of the most brilliant physicians to ever graduate from Johns Hopkins University. The whole town of Millbrook, population 347, thought they were getting a nurse to help their aging doctor. What they were actually getting was a secret that could either save their entire community or see her swinging from a rope. She had to play her part perfectly. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, one moment of revealing just how much she actually knew, and it would all be over. And in a town this small, secrets had a way of getting out. The man sent to collect her was named Tom Bradley. He was a miner, built like a rock, with hands so calloused they looked like they were carved from wood. He sized her up with a single skeptical glance. "You Miss Sullivan?" "Catherine Sullivan. You can call me Kate," she said, forcing a gentle, deferential smile she'd practiced in the mirror for weeks. She extended a gloved hand. His grip was like a vice. It wasn't a greeting. It was an evaluation. "Doc Hartwell's been waiting. Hope you're ready. This ain't Boston." The lie came so easily now. "I'm quite prepared, Mr. Bradley." She wasn't prepared for anything. Her experience was in sterile operating theaters and university lecture halls, debating complex diagnoses with the country's finest medical minds. She'd performed appendectomies, set compound fractures, and diagnosed rare fevers. She had never, not once, worked as a nurse, but she had to convince everyone she had. It was the only way she'd ever get to practice medicine again. The wagon rumbled down the town's single dirt street. It was a picture torn from a dime novel. The Silver Dollar Saloon, Henderson's General Store, a handful of wooden houses clinging to the mountainside. But Kate's eyes saw something different. She saw the man on the hotel porch with the telltale yellow tinge of jaundice in his eyes. She heard the persistent, rattling cough of a miner that spoke of lungs thick with rock dust. She saw a town full of sickness, a town that desperately needed a doctor, even if they would never accept one that looked like her. "That's Doc Hartwell's place," Tom said, pointing to a two-story building that looked a little sturdier than the rest. This was it. Dr. Marcus Hartwell, the man she had to fool, the man who held her entire future in his hands. Her stomach tightened into a knot. He was part of the very system that had cast her out, the old guard of male doctors who believed a woman's place was anywhere but in a clinic. The door opened before they even arrived. A man in his early 40s stood in the frame. He had tired eyes, prematurely gray hair, and a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand. Kate saw it instantly. Her mind began running through diagnoses. Progressive neurological deterioration, early Parkinson's. This man wasn't just overworked. He was sick. "Miss Sullivan, you're finally here," he said, his voice educated but weary. He took the forged certificate from her hand and gave it a cursory glance. Kate held her breath. A real doctor, a sharp one, might see the flaws, the tiny imperfections that would give her away. But Hartwell just nodded. "Thank you, Tom. I can take it from here." He waited until the miner was gone, his eyes fixed on Kate. There was a look in them she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just relief. It was something else, something closer to desperation. "I must be frank with you, Miss Sullivan," he began, his voice low. "This position is more challenging than the agency described." Here it comes, she thought. The test. He's going to quiz me. "I'm prepared for whatever the work requires, doctor." He turned to look out the window, his movements slow and deliberate. "We see everything here. Mining accidents that would challenge a Denver surgeon, complicated births in the dead of winter. The nearest real hospital is 2 days away, if you're lucky." He turned back to face her, and the look in his eyes was so intense it made her pulse hammer against her ribs. "Miss Sullivan," he said, the words hanging in the air, "how comfortable are you, expanding your duties beyond typical nursing responsibilities. This was the moment, the knife's edge. If she seemed too eager, he'd be suspicious. If she seemed too timid, she'd be useless. Frontier conditions often require flexibility, doctor, she said, choosing her words like a surgeon choosing an instrument. I'm willing to take on whatever responsibilities you feel are appropriate. He studied her face, searching for something. It was as if he was trying to see right through her carefully constructed facade. The truth is, Miss Sullivan, the workload has become difficult. He was hiding it, the tremor, the way he braced himself against the doorframe. He was a doctor in decline, and he was terrified. He wasn't just overworked, he was losing his ability to practice medicine, and he knew it. And in that moment, Kate realized something chilling. Dr. Hartwell's desperation wasn't just about finding help. It was about finding a replacement. He hadn't just hired a nurse. He was searching for a miracle. And she had no idea if she was the miracle he was looking for or the mistake that would destroy them both. The first test came less than a week later. It came in the form of a man the miners called Dynamite Pete, carried in on a makeshift stretcher, his leg a mangled ruin of shattered bone and torn flesh. A support beam in the Silver Strike mine had snapped, and Pete had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tom Bradley, the same miner who'd picked her up from the station, burst through the door. "Doc, a beam collapsed on his leg. It's bad." Dr. Hartwell rushed to gather supplies, but the stress of the emergency made his tremor worse. His hands shook so violently he could barely organize the instruments. He was falling apart right in front of her. "Miss Sullivan, prepare the surgery," he barked. But then he paused, a flicker of confusion clouding his eyes. He couldn't remember what he needed. Kate stepped in, her voice calm and steady, disguising her medical diagnosis as a simple nursing suggestion. "Bone saw, surgical needles, and morphine for the pain, doctor?" she asked as if the thought had just occurred to her. "Yes, exactly. Good thinking," he said, his relief so obvious it was painful. She had just covered for him, plugging a hole in his memory that could have cost Pete his life. The miners laid Pete on the table. One look at the leg told Kate everything. A compound fracture of both the tibia and fibula, massive tissue damage, a limb that was almost certainly lost. "He's going to lose that leg for sure," one of the miners whispered. Dr. Hartwell began his examination, but his trembling hands made it clumsy, uncertain. He was missing things, vital things. Kate could see the minutes ticking away, each one bringing infection and decay closer. "Miss Sullivan, assist me," he said, stepping back. It was the opening she needed. Her fingers, trained by years of study, moved with a precision that was anything but a nurse's. She traced the fracture, assessed the nerve damage, and searched for a pulse. And then she found it, a faint, thready beat. "Doctor," she said carefully, framing the critical information as a humble observation, "I believe I can feel a pulse in the dorsal pedis artery. The foot is still receiving circulation." Hope flared in Hartwell's eyes. "You're right. I'd missed it." He began to outline a surgical plan, but he was hesitating. The complex procedure, the delicate work of saving the leg, was beyond his current physical ability. His mind was still sharp, but his hands were traitors. Kate saw her chance. "Doctor," she said quietly, shielding her words from the miners, "perhaps you should review the surgical approach while I prepare the patient. It might help to visualize the procedure." It was a masterful piece of diplomacy. She was giving him an excuse to consult his medical texts, to shore up his failing confidence. But more importantly, it gave her a few precious minutes alone with the patient. With Hartwell gone, she worked fast, conducting the kind of thorough examination she was trained for. The injury was horrific, but it wasn't hopeless. She saw a path forward, a narrow, treacherous surgical route that could save the limb. But she couldn't be the one to do it. When Dr. Hartwell returned, looking pale, she presented her findings as a series of simple nursing observations. "Doctor, the nerve responses seem intact here, and the bone fragments appear to be contained within the soft tissue." He stared at her, a flicker of awe mixed with suspicion. "Miss Sullivan, that's a remarkably detailed observation for a nurse." Her heart hammered. Had she gone too far? "I worked with several surgeons back east, doctor. I learned what to look for." The surgery was a 3-hour tightrope walk. Officially, Kate was the assistant. In reality, she was the conductor, guiding the entire orchestra with subtle cues and suggestions. When Hartwell's hands shook too much to place a suture, she would steady them under the guise of helping. When he struggled to find an anatomical landmark, she would position a retractor to illuminate it perfectly. She became his eyes and his hands, anticipating every need, placing the right instrument in his grasp a second before he asked for it. Together, in this silent, desperate dance, they did the impossible. They saved Dynamite Pete's leg. As they closed the final suture, Hartwell looked at her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion, gratitude, and profound suspicion. "Your assistance was exceptional," he said. "Where exactly did you say you trained?" The question was a trap. She felt it snap shut around her. "Various hospitals in Boston, doctor," she said, focusing intently on cleaning the instruments, avoiding his gaze. "I found that surgeons appreciate a nurse who can anticipate their needs." The compliment was a double-edged sword. It felt good to have her skills recognized, but every ounce of praise brought her one step closer to being discovered. That night, the whole town was buzzing. They weren't just talking about Doc Hartwell. They were talking about the new nurse, the one who seemed to know what the doctor needed before he did, the one who worked with the calm, steady hands of a surgeon. Margaret Henderson, who ran the general store, brought over a basket of food. "Tom Bradley says he's never seen anything like it," she said, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "He said you two worked like you'd been partners for years. You must have had some remarkable training." Kate just smiled and deflected, but she knew the whispers had started. She was no longer just the new nurse. She was a mystery, and in a town like Millbrook, mysteries demanded to be solved. She sat in her small room that night, the weight of her deception pressing down on her. She had saved a man's leg, but she had also revealed a dangerous glimpse of the truth. Dr. Hartwell's condition was deteriorating faster than she'd realized. The town's needs were greater than he could handle, and her own skills were becoming impossible to hide. She was walking a razor's edge, and she had a terrifying feeling that she was about to fall. The threat of exposure didn't come from a miner or a suspicious shopkeeper. It came from the one man in town who was as educated as she was, Father Miguel Santos. He was the town's Catholic priest, a man who had studied medicine for 2 years in Mexico City before taking his vows. He arrived at the clinic one morning carrying a young Mexican woman, Maria Gonzalez, who was bleeding heavily from a miscarriage. Dr. Hartwell was miles away at a remote mining camp. Kate was alone. "Senorita Sullivan," the priest said, his English precise and accented. "She needs help. Now." Kate's training took over. The woman was in shock, her pulse weak and thready. This was a surgical emergency, something far beyond the scope of a nurse. There was no time to wait, no time for deception. "Get her on the table," Kate commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she normally kept hidden. As she worked, she was aware of Father Santos watching her. He wasn't just a concerned priest. He was observing her technique, her efficiency, the way she palpated the woman's abdomen and laid out surgical instruments with a practiced, confident hand. "Your examination is very thorough, Miss Sullivan," he said quietly. "You seem to know exactly what to look for." Panic flared in her chest, but Maria was fading. "I've assisted in cases like this before, Father. We have to stop the bleeding." She was about to perform a procedure that was illegal for a nurse to even attempt. "Should we not wait for Dr. Hartwell?" he asked, but his tone was a test. He knew as well as she did that Maria would be dead by then. "She doesn't have the time," Kate said, meeting his gaze. She was taking a massive risk, exposing her skills to the one man in town who might actually understand what he was seeing. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. "What do you need me to do?" For the next hour, he assisted her, translating her instructions to Maria, keeping the young woman calm. But all the while he watched. He watched her handle the curette with surgical precision. He watched her administer medication with a physician's confidence. He saw not a nurse, but a doctor at work. When it was over and Maria was resting safely, he helped Kate clean the instruments. The silence in the small room was heavy with unspoken words. Finally he spoke. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice soft but firm, "I studied medicine before I entered the priesthood. What you just did, that was not nursing. That was a skilled surgical procedure. You saved that young woman's life. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading. Her secret was out. She stood frozen, her mind racing. Should she lie? Deny it? Please let me finish, he said gently. I saw someone with extensive surgical training. Your knowledge of anatomy, your decision-making, these are not the skills of a nurse. He moved a step closer. I also saw someone who risked everything to save a woman that many in this town would have dismissed. Whatever your secret is, your heart's in the right place. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She found herself telling him part of the truth, about the barriers, the refusal of hospitals to hire a woman doctor, the desperation that had driven her west. So you came here to practice medicine in secret, he said, his expression a mixture of sympathy and concern. It is a dangerous game you are playing. Will you tell anyone? She whispered. A warm smile touched his lips. Your secret is safe with me, señorita, but I hope one day you find the courage to practice openly. This community needs a physician like you. He became her silent partner, her secret ally. He began referring patients from the Mexican quarter, people who had been too afraid or too proud to come to the clinic before. But his help was a double-edged sword. The cases he brought were complex, forcing Kate to walk an even finer line. When a young boy arrived with the telltale signs of appendicitis, Dr. Hartwell, in a moment of confused exhaustion, nearly misdiagnosed it. Doctor, Kate interjected gently, the pain seems to be localizing in the right lower quadrant. She was feeding him the diagnosis, line by line, disguising her medical assessment as a simple nursing observation. Yes, I see, he said, latching onto her words. It's consistent with, he trailed off, his memory failing him. Appendicitis, doctor? She prompted. Of course, appendicitis. Thank you, Miss Sullivan. She was no longer just his assistant. She was becoming his memory, his diagnostic mind, his steady hands. And people were starting to notice. The appendectomy was another flawless performance, with Kate guiding the faltering Dr. Hartwell through the procedure. The boy's life was saved. But the whispers grew louder. They reached the ears of Mayor John Patterson, a man who owned half the town and had an investment in knowing everyone's business. He cornered Dr. Hartwell in the clinic's waiting room. Kate listened from the next room, her blood turning to ice. Doc, the mayor said, his voice a low grumble, folks are saying your new nurse has skills that seem advanced. Tom Bradley says she knew as much about that surgery as you did. Now word is she practically performed that appendectomy herself. Miss Sullivan is an exceptionally well-trained nurse, Hartwell said, his voice tight. I'm sure she is, Patterson replied, his tone dripping with skepticism. But I think the town council ought to know a little more about her. Where exactly did she train? The threat was unmistakable. The mayor was launching an unofficial investigation. He was pulling at the loose threads of her story, and Kate knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was only a matter of time before the entire fabrication unraveled. Her ally, Father Santos, had promised to keep her secret, but she was quickly realizing that he might be the only one. And in a town full of watching eyes, that wasn't nearly enough. The crisis that finally ripped her secret into the open didn't start with a miner's cough or a backroom whisper. It started in the one place she should have been safe, the Sunday morning church service. Mayor Patterson's 15-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, the prettiest girl in town, was standing beside her father singing a hymn when she suddenly swayed, her eyes rolling back in her head, and collapsed to the floor, her body seized by violent convulsions. Panic erupted. The girl's back arched, her jaw clenched shut. Lockjaw! Someone screamed. Dr. Hartwell was miles away at a remote camp. He wouldn't be back for hours. Kate sat frozen in the back pew, her mind a battlefield. Every instinct screamed at her to run to the girl, to help. But if she did, if she showed what she knew, her deception would be over. Everyone would see. But as she watched, Elizabeth's breathing became ragged, foam flecking her lips. Kate recognized the signs instantly. It wasn't lockjaw. It was strychnine poisoning. Accidental, most likely from rat poison, but just as deadly. Without immediate expert intervention, the girl would be dead in minutes. The mayor knelt beside his daughter, his face a mask of terror. Somebody do something. She's dying. Kate made a choice. To hell with the secret. She pushed through the terrified crowd. Everyone back, give her air, she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned the congregation into silence. Mayor Patterson, help me get her to the clinic. Now. Shouldn't we wait for Dr. Hartwell? The Reverend stammered. There's no time, Kate shot back, already working on Elizabeth, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. This is poisoning. Every second counts. At the clinic, she became the doctor she was trained to be. She administered activated charcoal, used chloral hydrate to control the seizures, and monitored the girl's vital signs with a focus so intense the rest of the world ceased to exist. She worked for hours, a whirlwind of competence and skill, completely forgetting the role she was supposed to be playing. Mayor Patterson watched her, his initial panic slowly replaced by a dawning, stunned realization. He saw the way she calculated dosages, the way she explained the toxicology, the way she confidently managed a life-threatening medical emergency. When the crisis finally passed and Elizabeth was resting under sedation, breathing peacefully, the mayor turned to Kate, his eyes narrowed. Miss Sullivan, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, what you just did, that wasn't nursing. That was the work of a physician. The moment had finally arrived. The lie had run its course. Before she could answer, Father Santos appeared at the door. He took in the scene at a glance. The recovering girl, the stunned mayor, and Kate standing over her patient, her face smudged with charcoal, her secret finally exposed. Mayor, Patterson said, his voice thick with confusion. Miss Sullivan, she just saved my daughter. But she did it like she's a doctor. The mayor pressed her, his suspicion now a certainty. I want the truth, Miss Sullivan. All of it. Why are you pretending to be a nurse when you have the skills of a doctor? There was no escape. She looked him in the eye and let the truth fall between them, like a guillotine blade. I trained at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, she said, her voice steady. I graduated with a medical degree, but no hospital would hire a woman doctor. I came west so I could practice medicine, even if it meant doing it like this. The silence in the room was absolute. The mayor stared at her, his expression an unreadable mix of anger, shock, and a grudging, undeniable respect. He had been on the verge of exposing her as a fraud, and that very fraud had just saved his daughter's life. So you've been deceiving this entire town, he said slowly. I've been saving lives, she countered, her voice ringing with the quiet dignity of the truth. Elizabeth is alive because of my training. Peter Mackenzie has his leg because of my training. Maria Gonzalez survived because of my training. His eyes flickered towards his sleeping daughter. He was a politician, a pragmatist, but he was also a father, and his daughter would be dead if not for the woman standing before him. My daughter needs continued care, he said finally, his voice rough. Dr. Hartwell isn't here. Will you continue to treat her? Of course. Then that's all that matters right now, he said, but his eyes gave a clear warning. We will discuss the rest later. The news spread through Millbrook like a wildfire, but the reaction wasn't what Kate had feared. There was no anger, no talk of fraud. There was only gratitude. Margaret Henderson arrived with breakfast. I don't care what some piece of paper says, she declared. You saved Elizabeth Patterson. That's all the qualification I need. Tom Bradley and a group of miners showed up next. Miss Sullivan, Tom said, his hat in his hands. As far as we're concerned, you're the best doctor this town's ever had. The people she had healed, the families she had saved, were rallying to her side. They didn't care about her forged certificate or her hidden degree. They cared about her results. When Mayor Patterson returned that afternoon, he found a crowd of townspeople gathered outside the clinic in a silent, powerful demonstration of support. He looked at Kate, a new understanding in his eyes. He realized he was no longer in control of her secret. The whole town knew, and they had chosen their side. Miss Sullivan, he said, his tone no longer a threat, but a negotiation. It seems you have more support than I anticipated. Perhaps it's time we discussed how to resolve this situation in a way that serves everyone's interests. The crisis had become an opportunity. The lie was dead. But in its place was a new, even more dangerous question. Could a woman, An unlicensed, fraudulent doctor convince an entire town to defy the law and accept her for who she really was? Her life was no longer in her hands. It was in theirs. The meeting that decided her fate took place in the back room of Henderson's General Store. It was a trial in everything but name. On one side sat Mayor Patterson and the town council. On the other, Kate stood alone, armed only with her Johns Hopkins diploma and the truth. Samuel Morrison, the town's bank president and a man who saw the world in black and white rules, came out swinging. "Let's call this what it is, fraud," he boomed. "This woman has practiced medicine illegally. She has placed this entire community at legal risk." "I have medical credentials that exceed what was required," Kate countered, her voice calm. "Under false pretenses," Morrison shot back. "You are an unlicensed physician." Then an unexpected voice cut through the tension. Dr. Hartwell. He looked frail, his illness more pronounced, but his voice was firm. "Samuel, perhaps we should focus on results. In the months Miss Sullivan has been here, our medical outcomes have improved dramatically. So we ignore the law because she's competent?" Morrison scoffed. "I'm suggesting," Hartwell said, his voice rising with a strength Kate hadn't heard before, "that competence matters more than paperwork when lives are at stake." Margaret Henderson slammed her hand on the table. "He's right. My nephew is alive because of her. Elizabeth Patterson is alive because of her." The debate raged, a battle between rigid rules and frontier pragmatism. Kate laid her diploma on the table. "These documents prove I received the same education as any man. The only difference is that no state medical board will grant a license to a woman." Then Dr. Hartwell did something that changed everything. He told them his own secret. "There's something you all need to know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been diagnosed with a progressive neurological deterioration. Within a year, maybe two, I will be unable to practice medicine at all." The room fell silent. His support for Kate wasn't just professional, it was personal. It was desperate. He wasn't just helping a colleague. He was ensuring the town he loved wouldn't be left to die when he was gone. "Miss Sullivan's arrival," he continued, looking around the table, "was a blessing. She has been allowing me to serve our patients while preparing for a transition that is inevitable." The council voted. It was 4-1. Kate was to become Dr. Hartwell's official medical associate, her qualifications known to all. She had won. But Samuel Morrison's parting words were a chilling promise. "I hope you understand the risk you're taking. When the territorial authorities hear about this, don't expect me to defend you." He was right. 2 weeks later, a man named James Crawford arrived in town. He was a territorial health inspector, a thin, pale man with the cold eyes of a predator, and he had come for Kate. "Miss Sullivan," he said, appearing in the clinic doorway, "I'm here to investigate reports of irregular medical practice." Someone had talked. Someone had sent for him, and Kate knew exactly who it was: Samuel Morrison. Crawford's investigation was relentless. He wasn't just checking records, he was building a case. "My information suggests you've been practicing medicine independently, making diagnoses and performing procedures that exceed nursing authority." "I work as Dr. Hartwell's associate," Kate said, her hands steady as she stitched up a miner's hand. "Territorial law doesn't recognize the position of medical associate for an unlicensed practitioner," Crawford snapped. "You are either a licensed physician or you are not. And you, Miss Sullivan, are not." Dr. Hartwell tried to intervene, to take responsibility, but Crawford waved him off. The inspector had a file full of detailed notes, information so specific it could have only come from someone watching their every move. After 3 days of interrogating patients and seizing records, Crawford delivered his verdict. "I will be filing a report recommending that territorial authorities take action against both of you. You, Miss Sullivan, for illegal practice, and you, Dr. Hartwell, for supervising it." The threat was clear: arrest, prosecution, the end of everything. As Crawford prepared to leave town, Kate felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She had won the town, but she was about to lose the war. The law was coming for her, and community support wouldn't be enough to stop it. But the frontier had one last test for her, a test that would dwarf everything that had come before. A grizzled prospector on an exhausted horse came thundering into town, his face a mask of terror. "Doc, Miss Sullivan, you gotta come quick. It's Copper Creek. There's a sickness. It's killing the children." He described the symptoms: a raging fever, a terrible sore throat, and strange gray patches in their mouths that were choking them to death. Kate's blood ran cold. She knew instantly what it was: diphtheria, a plague, one of the most feared and deadly diseases of the age, and it was loose in a remote mining camp with no doctors and no hope. And in that moment, Kate Sullivan understood a terrible truth. The territorial authorities were coming to prosecute her for practicing medicine, but first she was going to have to go and practice more of it than she ever had in her life, to save an entire camp full of people who were about to die. Her greatest triumph would also be her most damning piece of evidence, and she had no choice but to create it. The ride to Copper Creek was a race against death. The mining camp was a scene from a nightmare. A dozen crude cabins huddled in an eerie, unnatural silence. The usual noise of men and machinery had been replaced by the sound of muffled sobs and the ragged, desperate gasps of children struggling for air. 18 people, mostly kids, were infected. 2 were already dead. Dr. Hartwell, weakened by the journey, was barely able to stand. His mind was willing, but his body had failed him. He looked at Kate, his eyes full of a terrible understanding. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice trembling, "it's up to you. I can't. My hands." She was on her own. For the first time, she shed the last remnants of her disguise. She was no longer Nurse Sullivan. She was Dr. Catherine Sullivan of Johns Hopkins University, and she was at war. "We need to establish an isolation ward now," she commanded the stunned miners. "Anyone with symptoms goes in here. Anyone healthy stays out. Boil all the water. Burn any soiled linen." She moved from cabin to cabin, a whirlwind of focused energy. Her training took over, a symphony of diagnosis and treatment conducted in the heart of a plague. She administered the precious antitoxins she'd had the foresight to bring, her mind a rapid-fire calculator of dosages and timetables. The crisis came on the first night. Young Timothy Patterson, a boy of 6, was suffocating. The gray, leathery membrane of the diphtheria had sealed his throat. His face was turning blue. He had minutes, maybe seconds left. There was only one option: an emergency tracheotomy, a surgical procedure to cut a hole in his windpipe. It was delicate, dangerous work to be performed on a child, by lamplight in a filthy cabin, with no assistance. Dr. Hartwell could only watch, helpless. "Do it, Miss Sullivan," he whispered. "You have my authorization. Do whatever it takes." With the boy's parents holding the lamp, their faces pale with terror, Kate worked. She made the incision, her hand as steady as the mountain outside. She dissected through the layers of tissue with a precision born of countless hours in the anatomy lab. She inserted the breathing tube. There was a sudden, miraculous hiss of air. Timothy Patterson was breathing. She had pulled him back from the very edge of the grave. The story of the surgery swept through the camp. She wasn't just a nurse who was good in a pinch. She was the woman doctor who had performed a miracle. They stopped calling her Miss Sullivan. They started calling her Doctor. For 3 days and 3 nights, she didn't sleep. She performed 2 more tracheotomies. She administered antitoxin to every infected person. She held the hands of the dying and celebrated with the parents of the recovering. She was a physician in the truest sense of the word, using every ounce of her knowledge and courage to fight back the darkness. By the end of the week, the plague was broken. Of the 18 people who had been infected, 17 were alive and recovering. She had walked into a death camp and turned it into a nursery. But as she rode back to Millbrook, exhausted but triumphant, a cold reality set in. She had openly, flagrantly, and repeatedly practiced medicine without a license. She had performed surgery. She had saved dozens of lives in the most public way imaginable. The grateful families of Copper Creek would become the star witnesses for her prosecution. Her greatest achievement was about to become the hammer that destroyed her. And sure enough, Inspector Crawford was not the only one who had heard the story. A new man arrived in Millbrook, Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, a prominent physician from Denver, sent by the Territorial Medical Board. He wasn't a bureaucrat like Crawford. He was the establishment itself. He met her in the hotel dining room. He had a thick folder of documents on the table in front of him. Miss Sullivan, he began, his voice cold and professional, I have reviewed testimony from 18 families at Copper Creek. They describe you performing independent surgical procedures and functioning as their primary physician. These are not the actions of a nurse. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was her forged nursing certificate. Furthermore, he said, his eyes like chips of ice, my investigation has revealed this document to be a fraud. I will be recommending to the board that they pursue formal charges against you. Dr. Hartwell will also face disciplinary action for supervising you. It was over. She had saved a town, but she had damned herself. What about the lives that were saved? She asked, her voice hollow. Doesn't that matter? Miss Sullivan, Dr. Whitmore replied, standing to leave. Successful outcomes do not justify illegal methods. The law is the law. She returned to the clinic, the world collapsing around her. But she didn't find despair. She found the town. Mayor Patterson was there. So were Margaret Henderson, Tom Bradley, and Father Santos. They had heard and they were ready to fight. We need to challenge them, Father Santos said, his eyes burning with conviction. He had been researching territorial law. There are provisions for emergency medical practice in communities that lack a licensed physician. Dr. Hartwell's condition, the epidemic. We can argue that your practice has been not only necessary, but legal under these specific circumstances. Mayor Patterson leaned forward. We'll get testimony from every family you've treated. We'll take the fight to them in Denver. It was a crazy, impossible long shot. A disgraced, unlicensed woman doctor and a handful of dirt-poor miners against the entire territorial medical establishment. But as Kate looked at the faces of the people who were willing to risk everything for her, she knew she had to try. If we're going to fight this, she said, a fire igniting in her soul, we do it completely. No more hiding, no more pretending. My name is Dr. Catherine Sullivan, and I'm going to demand my right to practice medicine. The hearing in Denver was designed to intimidate. A grand courtroom, 3 stern-faced doctors from the Territorial Medical Board sitting like judges, and Dr. Whitmore at the prosecutor's table, ready to dismantle her life, piece by piece. But Kate wasn't alone. Behind her sat the people of Millbrook, Dr. Hartwell looking frail but determined. Mayor Patterson, Father Santos, and a dozen miners and their wives who had traveled for 2 days to speak for her. Dr. Whitmore laid out his case with devastating precision. The fraudulent certificate, the unlicensed practice, the testimony from Copper Creek, twisted from a story of heroism into a list of crimes. It was a slam dunk. Legally, she didn't have a prayer. Then it was her turn. She stood, placed her Johns Hopkins diploma on the evidence table, and spoke, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the silent chamber. I admit I came to Colorado without a license, she began, but I came as a fully trained physician who was denied the opportunity to practice legally because of my gender, not my qualifications. I hid my credentials not to deceive my patients, but to serve them. She laid out her education, her honors, her training. The only difference between my qualifications and those of any licensed physician in this room, she said, looking each board member in the eye, is that I am a woman. Then her witnesses spoke. Tom Bradley described how she rebuilt Dynamite Pete's leg. Maria Gonzalez, through a translator, told of the emergency surgery that saved her from bleeding to death. Mrs. Patterson wept as she recounted how Kate had pulled her daughter Elizabeth back from the brink of strychnine poisoning. The most powerful testimony came from the families of Copper Creek. One by one, they told the board how this woman, this illegal doctor, had walked into a plague and saved their children. They spoke of her skill, her courage, and her compassion. The formal legal proceeding transformed into a raw, emotional testament to what a doctor is truly meant to be. The board members, who had begun the day with cold disdain, were now listening with rapt, conflicted attention. Father Santos presented his legal argument, citing the obscure territorial law about emergency practice. Dr. Hartwell gave a deposition about his own failing health, explaining that Kate's presence had been the only thing keeping medical care alive in Millbrook. The board retreated to deliberate. The 90 minutes they were gone felt like a lifetime. When they returned, the chairman, Dr. Harrison, looked down at Kate, his face unreadable. Miss Sullivan, he began, his voice booming, This board has considered all evidence. We find that your medical education is exemplary, and your clinical competence has been demonstrated through successful patient outcomes under the most challenging of conditions. Kate held her breath. However, he continued, and her heart sank, we cannot overlook the serious breaches of professional protocol. She prepared for the worst. Therefore, Dr. Harrison announced, this board rules as follows. We find that Catherine Sullivan possessed the qualifications and competence to provide the care she delivered. We recognize that frontier communities require arrangements that differ from urban standards, and we hereby grant Ms. Sullivan a provisional territorial medical license, contingent upon successful completion of the territorial examination within 6 months. The courtroom exploded. The miners cheered. Margaret Henderson sobbed with relief. Kate had done it. She had won. But Dr. Harrison wasn't finished. He looked out at the room, his voice full of a new historic weight. Furthermore, this board recommends that territorial regulations be modified to accommodate qualified physicians who can demonstrate competence regardless of gender. We will establish procedures for licensing qualified women physicians who wish to practice in this territory. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was a revolution. She hadn't just saved her own career. She had kicked down the door for every woman who would come after her. The journey back to Millbrook was a triumph. The sign outside the clinic was taken down. A new one was painted. It read simply, Dr. Catherine Sullivan, physician and surgeon. The lie she had arrived with was gone, burned away in the crucible of plague and prejudice. In its place stood the truth, harder and more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. She had come to the frontier seeking a place to hide, and instead, she had found a place to fight. She proved that a doctor's true authority comes not from a piece of paper, but from the lives they save and the hope they bring to the communities they serve. If this story touched your heart and you believe in fighting for what's right, no matter the odds, make sure you're subscribed. Because the fight for courage and justice never truly ends, and we've got more stories to share. Don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you in the next one.